Okay, and then you just want to say yes when you have the pop-up asking you if it's okay. And we do plan to turn off the recording during the Q&A period so people feel a little bit more open to answer and ask questions. I am so thrilled to have with us from Texas Julia Daley, a first-time guest here on the NAAP Happy Hour. Her debut novel is out, called No Names to Be Given by Admission Press. And I'll give you a little bit of a tease about it and then a little bit more about Julia, and then we'll sit back and enjoy. So from Austin, Texas, Mission Press is asking, would you be able to give up your firstborn to strangers? Told from the perspective of three women in the 1960s, the novel No Names to Be Given delves into the lives of three young women forced to do just that. The heartbreaking but uplifting debut novel by Julia Brewer Daley is a story that chronicles the desperate push and pull between family and redemption. Although this novel is a fictional account, it mirrors many of the adoption stories of its era. When three young unwed women meet at a maternity home in New Orleans in 1966, they are expected to relinquish their babies and return home as if nothing transpired. 25 years later, they are brought back together by blackmail and their secrets threatened with exposure all the way to the White House. And while this is fiction, our novelist is someone that knows the adoption world from the inside. Julia Brewer Daley holds a BS in English and an MS degree in education from the University of Southern Mississippi. She has been a communications adjunct professor at Belhaven University in Jackson, Mississippi, and public relations director of the Mississippi Department of Education and Millsaps College, a liberal arts college in Jackson. As the executive director of the Craftsman Guild of Mississippi, 300 artisans from 19 states, which operates the Mississippi Craft Center, she wrote their stories to introduce them to the public. So she's got extensive writing experience in nonfiction as well. She is a member of the Writers League of Texas, the Women Fiction Writers Association, the San Antonio Writers Guild, and the Women's National Book Association. Julia Daley is an adopted child from a maternity home in New Orleans. She searched and found her birth mother, and through a DNA test, her birth father's family as well. A lifelong Southerner, she now resides on a ranch in Fredericksburg, Texas, with her husband Emerson and Labrador retrievers, Memphis Belle and Texas Star. Let's welcome Julia Daley to the show. Thank you, Julia, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just delighted to have found your organization, and I'm thrilled to be here to tell one adoptee's story. I always had a great imagination as a child. All of my friends in elementary school or high school would probably say I told a lot of lies, but I made up a lot of stories. And I always wanted to have an audience for the stories. And my fellow Mississippian, William Faulkner, said, if a story's in you, it has to come out. So when I decided I wanted to write this story, I said it's inspired by a true story, and but it is fiction. And I was asked by a lot of people, why did you wait so long? Why did you wait so long to tell this story? Well, you know, a lot of stories have to begin in the middle, and I didn't have an ending to my story. I was still in the beginning stages of my story. So I waited, and I'm in good company because there are a lot of debut novelists who wait until after the age of 50 to tell their stories. There's a long list of them. Some of you who are my age especially remember the Little House stories, and she was 65 before she wrote those books. I've been very fortunate to have a lot of praise for this book. Stacy Swan, who's the author of a very great book called Olympus, Texas, the U.S. Review of Books. It received a #1 on Amazon in adoption and #1 in women's studies. It's had a lot of awards. And the synopsis, as Michele was talking about, it begins in 1965, 1966, and these 3 women have different paths to the maternity home, but they all meet there where they relinquish their babies. And then it becomes kind of a thriller. I've gotten hooked on thrillers. I don't know if any of you like psychological thrillers, but this kind of has that slant to it. And people ask me how much of that is true, and there's not a lot of truth in that part of the story. But I went from this maternity home to my hometown in Mississippi. This is where I was born, in New Orleans. If any of you are familiar with New Orleans, it's on Washington Avenue. If you've eaten at Commander's Palace, which is a great restaurant there, it's on the same street. I'm not sure when it exactly closed as a maternity home. It's now condos. And so I went and started my book tour there. I wanted to start at the beginning, at my origin story. And so I went to the maternity home and visited a lot of places there where a lot of the birth mothers told me they walked across the street to a little corner grocery, when they were staying here at the home. So all of that is still there, and very poignant to begin my journey again there. This is my adoptive mother holding me when they brought me home to Mississippi. And this was my christening with my first cousin. We were only a month apart in age. And when I had my first child, we had 5 generations of women in our family. But of course, the 3 on the right, my mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother shared, the same DNA. My daughter and I did not, but we still enjoyed being one of the 5 generations of that family. This was my childhood home and my adoptive family. You can see me there. My family, they were told that they would never be able to have children, so they adopted me. 19 months later, my brother was born, and 10 years later, my sister. So they did have birth children. I searched and found my first mother. The way I did that was that there was still a Napoleonic law on the books in New Orleans, in Louisiana, that said that an adopted child can inherit from their natural parents. Well, you can inherit from somebody that you don't know. So that loophole opened the records. I had to go almost like I was on a jury stand, in a courtroom, and they quizzed me about, how I was going to treat this woman if I found her. And they just, really ran me through the ringer trying to keep me from opening those records. And I don't know to this day how many records were opened at that time when that loophole was still on the books. I would like to know that. But I did receive my original birth certificate. And luckily, my birth grandmother was still at the address that was on the birth certificate. So I gave her a call and asked if she had a daughter who had given up a child for adoption in 1954. And she said, absolutely not. She was still keeping that secret and still denying that her daughter had given birth to me. But I just, said, if you will give my telephone number to your daughter, and if she'd like to call me, I'd like to hear from her. And she did. She called me that night. And this is her photo. So you can see we look a lot alike. And I met her, and she had 2 sons, and she had not told her sons that she had had me. So she had to break the news to them. She had told her husband. It's very interesting because he was actually a Jesuit priest. This is a little twist in the story. And he was counseling her when she gave birth to me, and he fell in love with her and married her and left the priesthood. So I always think that that's another novel right there. Then I took a DNA test, and one of the results came back, and a message that the reference line said, "Are you my sister?" Well, that'll get your attention. So sure enough, I found my birth father's family through the DNA results, and he had 2 other daughters. And this is one of my sisters who came through Texas and went hiking with me at Enchanted Rock, which is a national park here in Texas. You know, there are 100 million Americans who have adoption in their immediate family, and 7 million Americans today are adoptees. And I just find that to be such a huge number. And everywhere I go with this book, every time I talk to any organization, there are so many adoptees and so many birth mothers and so many adoptive parents that I speak to and hear their stories. Just listening to their stories has been, you know, my favorite part of this journey is listening to everyone's stories. There are a lot of well-known adoptees, some I didn't know about. Faith Hill I knew about because she's a Mississippi girl. John Lennon, Marilyn Monroe, Eleanor Roosevelt, Jack Nicholson. The history of maternity homes, I'm sure you all know about this, but the Salvation Army opened the first one that they have on record. And they were known as homes for unwed mothers. And before the 80s, housing for pregnant women where I was born. But then in the 70s and 80s, a lot of those homes started closing, but there's still 400 maternity homes operating in the US. And now most of the programs try to help the mothers keep the babies and find work, get their education. So I'm hopeful that that will continue. You know, there's so many current adoption issues. There's so many hot button issues in the news these days. You know, same-sex adoptive parents, adopting from different cultures, adoption versus abortion with all the states suing over Roe versus Wade, open record states versus, you know, open adoptions, national versus international adoption. It seems like every paper, every magazine you pick up now has a lot of these topics going on. And Michele had asked me if I would do a couple of readings from the book. If you don't mind, it would be an honor for me to do that.
And I got myself on mute. I would say we would love you to do that. The first one I was going to ask you is the beginning of chapter 17, and it spoke to me because I know a lot of us in the adoption community, we journal. And I love how this starts here, and the journal entries become a part of the later part of the novel. I promise no spoilers. But and we start to get a sense of the 3 different mothers that are in the home together. And if anyone has the book in front of you, it's page 107.
And I call this home Magnolia Home Hospital. Where I was born was the Methodist Home Hospital, so pretty similar. Magnolia Home Hospital, New Orleans, Louisiana, 1966. A scream awakened the girls in room 310. For hours upon hours, they heard intense moans and shouts. When the mother quietened, her baby wailed. Faith, Becca, and Sandy listened in the dark. Anyone awake? Becca said. How can we sleep through all that yelling? Sandy said. I feel so sorry for her. Faith's voice quaked. She pulled the chain on a bedside lamp and lifted her journal out of the nightstand drawer. From their calculations, the three of them had similar due dates for their babies. They all entered the maternity home in January at 8 weeks pregnant. Listening to the screams, Faith thought of her own delivery. Will others hear me in the night? What are you writing, Faith? Sandy said. I write about my feelings every day, and sometimes those become lyrics for my songs, Faith said. That sounds like schoolwork to me, Sandy sighed. It helps me make sense of what's going on in my life, Faith said, shrugging. I guess we all need journals then, Sandy said.
And so I have to ask you, is one of these mothers based on your birth mother?
You know, every birth mother I've spoken to kind of wound up with some of the traits in the book. And and people have asked me how I came up with these three different characters and their personalities and where they're from. And I said, you know, I tried to make them totally different from different walks of life because I didn't want anybody to think that only lower income bracket women were in this home. That women came from all walks of life, especially from the upper class. You know, they wanted to take the women and get them away from home and save the shame, you know, that society was heaping on women's heads. So I just wanted to show that, you know, they were very different, and a lot of them had characteristics of the birth mothers that I've interviewed.
Yeah, and I had a question before. There's another section you pointed out to me. I'd love if you would read to us. But I had a question going back to something earlier you said about having this idea for the story, but not writing the book yet because you had the middle and you didn't have the end. And I guess a few weeks ago, Marcy and introduced the two of us, and as we were talking, I realized that both of us spent part of our parenting years as single moms. So I thought I had the answer that you're probably just busy carpooling and changing diapers, but and that might not be the wrong answer. But when I heard that, I thought what I really want to ask when I think about all of us journaling and those 40 years is how did you keep the dream of writing a novel alive? So many people think they're going to write a book someday, and most don't.
Well, you know, I think that a story inside you will start nibbling at you and cause you to want to put it down on paper. And like you said, I was a single parent. I had two or three jobs at the time. You know, those are the busiest years when your children are small, and then even busier when they're teenagers. And I was supporting us and working full time. And I actually took a couple of classes at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, when I was public relations director there, because they allowed staff members to take free courses. So I took some writing courses and I wrote a couple of these chapters and I put them in a file. And when I moved to Texas in our retirement, um, I found those files when I was opening some boxes. And I said, you know, if I don't get this down on paper, I never will. And it reminded me that when I met my birth mother, I told her, she was asking me about all the careers I'd had and all the jobs that I'd had. And I said, well, you know, I feel in my chest that there's a ticking clock, and I'm not going to ever be able to get everything that I want to do in this life done in time before I leave this place. And she said, that is the strangest thing. Your grandmother said the exact same thing. So, my birth grandmother had felt the same way that I did. So that was another, tie. But I started taking classes in the craft of writing because I had written all my life and all the jobs that I'd ever had. I've done press releases. I've written speeches for presidents of colleges. I've taught communications in college, but writing fiction, writing a novel, writing a book of any kind is totally different than the writing that I had been doing. So I tried to take classes and to learn the craft so that I could make it a worthy effort.
Thank you for that. You mentioned your um, birth grandmother, but when you and Marcy and I were talking, you also mentioned some passages here are taken straight from your life. And one of them I found really poignant. It's set in 1971, and it's a grandmother and I'll leave it at that. It's an adoptive grandmother, and my heart just kind of skipped a few beats. Would you mind reading that section, that chapter?
Yes. And this adoptee in the story is very thinly disguised. She's named Julie instead of Julia, and Sullivan was, my name when I had my children. So it's very thinly disguised, but this is almost verbatim a story from my own childhood. Julie Sullivan, Mount Olive, Mississippi, 1971. Did they steal her from the Cherokee Nation, or was she the child of her adoptive father and a Cajun mistress in the Bayou country? Julie's childhood fantasies sent her imagination into overdrive sometime. If the mistress version was accurate, she felt compassion for her adoptive mother, who had accepted the fate of rearing a child from such demeaning circumstances. It seemed a likely scenario because everybody said she looked exactly like her adoptive father, and she was born in New Orleans. She was a daddy's girl and reconciled to the possibility of her father's betrayal, although she would never speak those beliefs out loud. She did not want to burden her mother any more than the act of rearing her husband's mistress's child already accomplished. Although Julie secretly believed she was her father's natural daughter because she had his olive skin that tanned easily, hazel eyes, and dark brown hair, when she studied her brother and sister's faces, born after Julie's adoption, she knew it was not likely. Their noses, cheekbones, and jawlines were exact replicas of her father's. Julie saw what she wanted to see in her own face when compared to his, but she did not dwell on the matter. Most of the time, she even forgot they had adopted her. When Julie was 5, her great grandmother, Mama Powell, visited from North Mississippi and asked, "How many offspring do I have? I want to know the number." Her daughter, Julie's grandmother, Maud, answered, "Oh gosh, Mama, I have no idea." "Well, figure it out for me." She handed Maud a pencil and pad of paper. "You have 12 children. Let's see if I can recall the names of all the grandchildren and great grands," Julie's grandmother added. Questions passed back and forth between them about this cousin or that nephew. 2 pots of coffee perked on the stove, and a blackberry cobbler was consumed. The afternoon passed, and while Maddie fried chicken for supper, they gave Mama Powell a number. She seemed satisfied until she pulled on her reading glasses and studied the list of names. "Wait a minute. These children don't belong on the list." She crossed 3 names off with a scratchy lead pencil sound. Watching her, Julie asked, "Who doesn't belong on the list, Mama Powell?" Julie's mother reacted with a startled voice. "Why don't you go see what your brother is doing?" But Julie persisted. "Who doesn't belong on the list?" "I want to see how many natural offspring I have," her great grandmother said. "Who's unnatural?" "Well, the ones adopted." The silence deafened. Julie's body flushed hot from her stomach to her face like a sudden fever. She did not think of herself as unnatural. She examined the familiar women seated around the yellow formica table in the kitchen. 4 generations of women, counting herself. Julie studied each one. all possess the same face, all but one. If I don't belong on this list do I belong on?
Thank you. And that cuts right to the heart of, I think, one of the core issues for adoptees is belonging. And now I want to kind of go somewhere related to that. You've been a writer in one form or another for most of your career, but I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're fairly new, or relatively new, at getting to know the adoption community of adult adoptees. Um, what's that been like? And is that a place of belonging, or are you still exploring, or what has that been like?
Oh, I think it's really a wonderful community, and I feel like we're all family, whether we're kin or not. We have some snatches of the same stories inside all of us. You know, we have some of the same journeys, and we're all searching, or we're healing, or we're trying to make sense of what's gone before, and that really, I think, binds us together. And every person who comes to a book signing who tells me that they're from the adopted community, I write on there, to my kindred spirit, because that's the way I feel. I feel that we're all kindred spirits.
Oh, I do too. And it's wonderful to go from kind of a sort of isolation, for me anyway, in a family, to discover that there's so many other adoptive families out there that we've all grown up in or been, or if there's adoptive parents, to find other adoptive parents, or birth parents, finally finding other birth parents. Um, One thing I love about your novel is the breadth of time. And sort of the breadth of genre, and I'm not going to get too artsy here, I hope, but it does span, I guess it's 25 years or a amount of time. So you see basically these girls that become mothers alone, except for their community of other mothers. And then we follow them through their lives. Um, but you described this as a thriller, and it really is. And I thought I didn't see that coming. That was really interesting. But there's another piece of it that makes this novel really rich to read, is that you clearly can write romance. And with some of the relationships between the birth mother and the birth father, or a birth mother and a later husband, you feel the love and you feel the hope and the romance and the excitement. And in some places, I just believed, the guy was going to burst through the door and carry the girl and her new baby away. And I won't say if that happened or not, but I really enjoyed the quality of the thriller writing and the quality of the romance writing here. But there's one thing that I thought was really interesting, and I think it's something special about maybe adoption fiction. Um, you've been at workshops, and they often tell you, oh, you can't use coincidences in fiction, it doesn't work. And you do here, and it works. It really works. And I just kind of had to sit back after I finished this book, and I read it in like a day. And I thought about that coincidence, and it reminded me of something that Jennifer Diane Gostin, who's an adoptee podcaster, calls reunion serendipity. And I love that term. Instead of just coincidence, it's reunion serendipity. And so many of us have, in real life, nonfiction, experienced reunion serendipity, that it works here in your novel. So I was dying to ask, have there been coincidences or serendipity that you've seen in your own real life reunion or reunions?
Well, when I grew up, everyone went. We say that in Mississippi, the two largest towns are Memphis and New Orleans, because that's where people went. And my father was always worried for me as an adopted child, because they would hear stories about twins being separated, or family members, who were out there. And he always worried that I would meet and fall in love with somebody who was, kin to me. So that little part of the story came from the fact that I've been told many times that twins were separated, and that sometimes they would meet. And people say to me all the time, that you're drawn to people who are your twin or you're in your family. And my father's fears that I heard apparently voiced throughout my childhood just kind of stuck in my head. So that's where that came from. But they were always worried that if we decided to go to Tulane to go to college in New Orleans, maybe my family was still there. Maybe I had siblings that I didn't know about. So, people worried about those kind of situations happening if you lived in a small area where all of your friends and family frequented a lot.
And did that ever happen? Did you, once you got to know who your blood relatives were, did it turn out any of them had been people that you would cross paths with?
Not when I was young, but I did find out through meeting these later in life siblings, and that we've all been in the same places many times. We don't know if we saw each other. We don't know if we would have recognized each other, but yes, I mean, we were in the same locations, in the same places. And as an adopted child, when you're young, you think, walking by somebody on the street, would I know if she is my birth mother? You think about those things, especially if you have a vivid imagination.
Hmm. And you do have a wonderful imagination, which I want to guess is why you decided to write fiction instead of memoir. But instead of guessing, I'm going to ask, because there's not as much fiction out there. I'm just trying to think of what novels, and the only two came to mind for that have unwed mothers' homes as a setting, or maternity home hospitals as a setting. One was Fannie Flagg's all-girl filling station, and the other one was John Irving's Cider House Rules. I couldn't think of any other besides your novels. So it's a pretty unique idea. Why did you decide to write a novel or tell these stories through fiction instead of a memoir?
Well, I wanted to use a little separation between my actual story and what was going on in my life. There were still people alive, my adoptive parents, my birth mother. Her family still didn't know that she had given birth, and I didn't want to expose her, for myself to write this story, even though I know it's my story. But I just thought it would give me a little distance to back up and to put what I wanted to, like the adoptee chapters in there, but to give a little distance between me and their own stories and the secrets that they were still holding on to.
Okay. Thank you. I'm thinking of adoptee stories, and one that was interesting that I actually didn't realize had to do with a song, and it's perfect for the time period, and it's perfect for this novel. And I think you know what I'm talking about. For people that have the book, this is now we're fast forward to 1982 and chapter 33 on page 177. Julie, would you read some of that? I thought that was an interesting passage.
This is another one of those passages that was pretty much verbatim from my childhood. Julie, Mount Olive, Mississippi, 1982. Saturday mornings meant going to the cemetery. Julie was 16 and didn't want to rise before noon, but her grandmother devised other plans. Julie and Mamu swept off the headstones and placed new plastic flowers at the grave, removing the faded ones from another season. The cemetery plots were important to Julie's family. Who would lie where? Mommy, where will I be? Julie explored empty plots devoid of headstones. Well, your parents will be here, so I guess you, your brother, and sister could be over there next to them. She pointed at vacant spaces. What about my husband and children? There are plenty of spaces for all of us. Her grandparents expected everyone together, even in death, so they had purchased more plots than necessary. Julie knew your final resting place was as important as where you started your life. A place in the obituaries was as significant. Her mother told her a woman should have her name in the newspaper only twice in her life, once when she married and then died. Any other times would be disgraceful. Just as Julie knew about cleaning graves routines, she knew summer rituals always included pilgrimages to New Orleans, her birthplace. Every year, Julie visited the maternity home where her life originated. It was a sentimental journey, and as her siblings and cousins knew the hospitals where they were born, Julie's parents wanted her to have an origin place too. The trip always ended at the maternity hospital. Julie remembered a bulletin board that showed photos of smiling babies and toddlers and scenes of children blowing out candles on birthday cakes. Letters from appreciative adoptive parents filled the spaces. Julie wondered if any birth mothers ever wanted to see the photos and if they could have guessed which child might be theirs. Every year, as they toured the home, her father told her about the day he and her mother came to meet her. When Julie was 16, she was riding in her mother's car with three of her best friends, Melanie, Pam, and Gail. A favorite song came on the radio. The Motown hit Love Child by Diana Ross and the Supremes was a rollicking tune that caused them to move in their seats to the music and sing loudly. Love Child. Love Child, different from the rest. Her mother briskly turned the radio knob as if it were too hot to touch. Mother, we were listening to that song, protested Julie. Her friends grew quiet. That's an obscene song, and I don't want you singing it anymore. Why do you even know the lyrics? Her voice sounded horrified. The Supremes are our favorite group, and we like all their songs. Julie peeked into the back seat where her friends shrugged their shoulders. Mothers are weird, they seemed to say. Little did she know, Julie's mother was thinking of the beginning of her daughter's life. Not until Julie was an adult did she realize why her mother believed the song was scandalous. She was the love child of the song.
Thank you. Thank you. I found it really interesting because you said this is autobiographical, that your family was open about showing you where the mother's home was and that you grew up visiting.
Yes, and my father mistakenly thought that when I became 18, he could open the records for me. I don't know where he got that idea, but he just always believed that he would be the one to be able to hand me my original birth certificate. And he was very disappointed that he couldn't gift me that.
That's really interesting. I guess we're roughly the same age. My parents were asked by my adoption agency to come and talk to other parents about the importance of even telling your child that they were adopted. So coming from that to hear that your parents obviously told you and obviously were relaxed enough and I guess felt close enough to you that they weren't threatened to give you back that piece of, I guess what we in the adoption world call our chapter one. You know, that's your chapter one isn't when you arrive in your adoptive home, but it's something that happened before you even were brought to your parents, your adoptive parents.
Well, I told my birth mother when I met her because she was worried all of my, life that that something might have happened to me, that I might have been placed with a family who were not kind to me. She said she would pick up magazines that would tell about child abuse, and she would grieve and think, did I give my child over, to that type of situation. And I told her, I said, you had a long time to worry and to grieve, and I was just being a child and didn't have that kind of grief to carry around with me for a long time.
Sure, sure. It sounds like it and it, this is probably a simple simplification, but it sounds like it was pleasant meeting your birth mother. Was it?
It was the strangest situation. I don't know how many of you have searched and found your first mother, but um, talking to her by phone was really great. I could ask all types of questions that I've never known before. When you're adopted and you go to a doctor, in the doctor's office, they're going to say, do you have heart disease or diabetes or cancer in your family? And you have to say, I don't know, because I'm adopted. And I hope that they're doing better with that now about giving children their health records. But I didn't know at the time. So when I went to meet her in New Orleans, it was really very poignant because I had always, as a teenager, driven up and down those streets, and if you know the Garden District in New Orleans, they have these beautiful old homes, these raised cottages, and I've always loved old homes, and I thought, one day I think I'm going to live in one of those raised cottages. And when I searched and found my birth mother, she was living in one of those raised cottages. So I had passed by her home many, many times. And I remember rushing across the street to meet her. She was standing on the porch waiting for me. And I lost a shoe in the street when I was trying to rush to her. And she said, just like Cinderella, when I came running across the street into her arms, and something just broke inside of me. It was just a feeling you can't describe, that, this was the woman who carried me for 9 months and gave birth to me. And yet I don't know her at all. It's a very strange situation. Um, but she was very gracious and told me the story. Um, she was Catholic. He was Jewish. Back in 1954, that was unheard of, that would, that they would be able to marry. And so he was called home to Chicago, to his home, and she gave me up for adoption. And she explained all of that to me. And I told her, I'm just so grateful for life. And we had a really nice relationship until her death.
That's so fortunate to hear. Um, Now I'm going to ask, just from the bio that we all heard, that you have had contact with some paternal family, or you've at least been able to identify them. Um, and everyone's story is different, but I think one generalization is adoptees tend to have more of a relationship with their birth mother in reunion. Um, and I've been working on a series called the Birth Fathers Club because I'm curious about the stories about reunions or rejections with birth fathers by adoptees. How was the situation with the other side of your DNA family?
Well, I write in the book, and the reason I pushed it forward to the 60s instead of writing about the 50s when I was actually born is I wanted to get close enough to where the DNA result kits, were available commercially. So I pushed it forward to 66 and even fudged a little because they didn't actually come out until the 90s for, home health, home DNA kits. But that is the way that I found the paternal family. She had told me their names and that they were in Chicago, but that name is very common in Chicago in the Jewish community. So I did not search very, diligently for him. Um, until I did this DNA kit and got the message from my sister that said, "Are you my sister?" And that will really get your attention. So she told me that he had passed away 30 years ago. So I did not get to meet him.
So that's
And
quite young then.
yes, he was quite young. So another health, issue that I didn't know about. And she says she doesn't know if he really knew about me. Now, my birth mother said that she called his mother in Chicago when I was born, still trying to see if they could marry and keep me. And his mother, said no, he's already, found a nice Jewish girl to marry. So um, um, my birth mother does not know if his mother told him, that I had been born. So his daughter said, I'm not sure that he would have known, but he had two other daughters, and my birth mother had two sons. So I have a lot of siblings out there. And it was fun because a first cousin from California, because of the DNA results, got in touch with me, and he said, I've done all of my genealogy. I know our family tree, and you don't show up anywhere. And I said, no, I don't show up too many places on your genealogy tree. And I explained to him, and he had grown up with my birth father in Chicago. And so I feel like I got to know my paternal side of the family through this man who had, known my father.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. I had something similar, and back in September, I spoke on the happy hour about it just real quickly. Through DNA, I found out I had a sister. Um, my birth father may or may not have known about her. He knew about me. And because of the timing with COVID, I didn't, and she had passed away. Because, but I found a best friend of hers who'd known her since she was 4 years old. I had to wait till I got the vaccine to fly to go see this friend, who sounds a little bit like your cousin in that she was able to give me a picture of what my sister was like.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
special. Are there things about your birth families that you want your kids to know about, that you want your children to remember?
Well, I've shared with my children ever since I met my first mother. She got to meet them, and so they just thought of her as another grandmother. Our family has always thought we have enough love to go around to as many family members as we can possibly get our arms around. So they got to know her, and they call her my mother. And um, my oldest daughter, I think I told you, had two birth children, and then she adopted four. So I have six teenagers in that household because she adopted children who were the same ages as her birth children. But she really believes in adopting from foster care and from um, the older children. So we adopted a 16-year-old, a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old. So they're all pretty stepped, and one is an amputee. So we have full gamut.
Full house, a real full house. Then I was
Mhm.
curious about some other adoptees, I guess a generation above, maybe, when in the passage that you read us, the second passage about the grandmother saying, no, not those three. Um, the other two, I'm assuming, are adoptees. Is that correct?
Yes, they were cousins who had adopted.
Okay. Has your search and reunion been something that you discuss or share with those two adoptees, or I don't know how close they are or not?
No, they were distant cousins, and we've all kind of lost touch. We had 11 first cousins in my adoptive family who grew up in the same small town of 1,000 people. So we grew up like brothers and sisters, and yet everybody's so scattered these days. They don't stay in the same place, and so we don't know each other's children as much as we'd like to. Everybody's living their own lives, and because my grandmother is gone, she used to be the one to get us all together and have family reunions, and now nobody does that anymore.
Maybe you can have a family reunion book signing at some point. I have so many more questions, but we've got great attendance, and I'm sure there's other people that would love to ask Julia some questions. So I guess, Jennifer, if we can open it up for other people as well.